British Museum is one of the great treasure houses of the world, a universal museum founded in the 18th century. It's therefore had, over the years, an opportunity to collect things on a scale that has been vouchsafed to very few other people. Among the great treasures of the museum is the Sutton Hoo ship burial, arguably the richest treasure found in British soil, certainly the richest grave found in Western Europe. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, which is displayed in a new gallery in the British Museum, a gallery which was opened this year, was found in 1939, just at the outbreak of war. It was excavated by a remarkable group of new archaeologists of that period, people who 20 years ago talked to the BBC about their experiences in a film entitled The £1 Million Grave.
The group of bracken-covered mounds known locally as Sutton Hills or Little Egypt because of their dryness and dustiness form part of the Sutton Hoo estate, which in 1938 was owned by Mrs. E.M. Pretty. 1938 was a slack year on the estate, so Mrs. Pretty decided it would be interesting to try to discover whether the mounds were burial mounds or not. After some negotiations with Ipswich Museum, the investigation was put into the hands of Basil Brown. Basil Brown was the son of a small farmer who developed a great knowledge of local soils and an extraordinary flair for finding things, and eventually, after a varied career, became a part-time employee of the Ipswich Museum. Mrs. Pretty let him lodge in an upstairs room in the chauffeur's cottage and agreed to pay him 30 shillings a week to take charge of the excavation. Very sensibly, Basil Brown decided not to start on the largest mound, but on this one. It turned out to have been robbed, like all three they dug that year, and the finds were not spectacular, though they did show that the mounds were Anglo-Saxon, not Bronze Age, as might have been thought. The finds included some broken pieces of ribbed blue glass, some gilt bronze objects, including a disc with a complicated interlaced pattern, some odd pieces of metalwork and some pottery, but the third mound did yield one significant thing.
The first thing was we put a trench from east to west, and we came across a heap of clinch snails from a ship, and these are usually associated with Scandinavian boats, and when we got down there was a boat-shaped grave, and some rivets were in position in the side. So it showed definitely that there was a boat.
Basil Brown had thus the experience, which was to be very important later on, of seeing what the remains of a boat looked like in those particular soil conditions. Mrs. Pretty was also sufficiently encouraged to go ahead the following year, 1939.
Well, when I came over, I met Mrs. Pretty and walked down to the mounds, and I said, which would you like excavated? And she said, what about that one?
One of the men who helped Basil Brown was Jack Jacobs, Mrs. Pretty's gardener.
Well, I assisted Mr. Brown here with the excavations of this tumler, and one night we had a very heavy thunderstorm. And Mr. Brown got up in the early hours of the morning and came across here. I don't know whether he would have kept it a secret or not, but I happened to be looking out of my window and he came home. And I'm sure that he had such a great interest and a great concern for this tremendous find. I believe that he would have slept here if he'd had his bed here. If he'd had his bed, he'd have slept here.
The most spectacular excavation in British archaeological history began prosaically enough with a trench at ground level into the centre of the mound. Then, on May the 11th, Jack Jacobs bent over and said, here's a bit of iron, and here's another.
Well, I made a rush and pushed him out of the way.
I found the first rivet. I call it rivet. I went to remove it, and he told me to replace it because he said it mustn't be removed until there's further investigations. And as I was a green hand, you see, I didn't understand much about the value of the things.
That was the bow of the ship. Then I carefully followed it down with bare hands and a trowel, and of course thinking that it was a small boat, but it was the bow of the ship, you see. Well, you wouldn't have expected a ship 8 feet long.
The unexpected discovery of the remains of a large ship in this mound was not a thing that could be kept entirely quiet. In June, rumours that inquiries about Viking ship burials were being made reached C.W. Phillips, a Fellow of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and Secretary of the Prehistoric Society. At once he made arrangements to visit the starting point of these rumours.
I walked towards the site from the lawn in front of Mrs. Pritti's house, came out onto the heath, and saw in front of me the group of barrows, and one of them with a very large mound of sand thrown up from it. I came round the end and looked, and there was a long trench which Basil Brown had dug, and in this trench there were the very clear indications of a long ship, possibly about 100 feet long. I couldn't be sure. Well, now, this was, of course, an astonishing sight. Nothing like it had ever been seen in England before. And I realized that it was necessary to bring the most important archaeological interests in the country into relationship with this as soon as possible. And therefore, after we'd looked at it for a short time, we went straight back to the house, got to the telephone, and within the hour, the British Museum and the Ministry of Works had been informed.
There was now an anxious period for Basil Brown, Jacobs and Spooner. They had found this remarkable ship, and they had to wait while the authorities made up their mind what was to be done. What the Ministry of Works did decide was to ask C.W. Phillips to take charge.
Well, of course, that never grasped me, because I didn't quite see how anybody was going to take it on, but since no one knew anything about it anyhow, as long as you're a reasonable and sensible person, it seemed to me you might have a bash, you see, so a bash we had, that's all.
Basil Brown had established the manner of the excavation by clearing down to the level of the ship in the mound. Now the next question was whether there was any burial chamber in the ship. These are nearly always robbed, so the excavators weren't particularly optimistic anyway. But first some pieces of wood and bronze appeared, and then on Sunday, July the 22nd, the whole character of the excavation changed. The person responsible was Margaret Guido.
I remember that Charles Phillips had gone down to Woodbridge, and we were working quietly away in our usual morning routine, cleaning up the structure of the ship, when quite suddenly, as I was troweling and brushing the sand, one of these lovely garnet and gold ornaments was revealed. And of course, from that moment, we were immensely excited. Everybody rushed round and said, this really is something tremendous, because it means we're not digging a Viking ship, but a Saxon one. And a few minutes after we were gathered round there, Charles Phillips returned, and I remember him saying, "My godfathers." And all day, for the rest of the day, he went on saying, "Oh dear, oh dear."
More pieces of jewellery, some much bigger than the first find, now began to appear in quick succession all over that part of the burial chamber.
We had sieves, and they were throwing arse into sieves, and I remember a sieve and a lovely brooch came into my eye. A beautiful gold brooch. And of course, I wasn't allowed to touch that. I had to turn that over quickly.
Even an archaeologist like John Ward Perkins, now director of the British School in Rome, who was visiting the site for the day, got involved in the process.
I was trusted with a trowel, and I had one of those strokes of rare good fortune which come all too rarely in an archaeologist's life, namely that of being there on the right day and at the right time, because it was precisely on that day that the finest remains of the burial group started to come to light. I personally had the good fortune to be placed where the belt buckle, the gold belt buckle, came out. And just near me, somebody else was excavating, or beginning to excavate, the remains of the gold and enamel purse. There's something very fascinating about gold. It comes out just as it lay in the earth, just as it went in. It is still bright and shining, and to dust the sand off and to see the gold with this pattern coming out among the sand is an experience that I shall personally never forget.
The gold also gave Stuart Piggott, now Abercrombie Professor of Prehistoric Archaeology at Edinburgh University, an unusual experience of a less serious kind.
As you know, whenever you're excavating anything, any monument of whatever period, people think that you must be finding gold, and usually ask you if you have. And on this occasion, I remember very well, after we had discovered some of the first of the gold objects, coming back to the pub in the evening, to the Bull in Woodbridge, for a much-needed drink, and having the usual question, "Well, old boy, we found any gold today?" "Yes," I said, "my pockets are absolutely full." And as I spoke, I was holding the box containing the great gold belt buckle in my rather sweaty hand in my pocket of my coat, and feeling the best thing to do was to take them at face value. "Oh," they said, "splendid, you must have a drink." Yes, I said, "I need one."
The jewellery all appeared near the sword, and was apparently part of a harness, a sort of Sam Brown belt for supporting it. The sword itself and its leather and wood scabbard had rusted into a solid mass, but the gold and garnet encrusted pummel and crosspiece were so well preserved that you can actually see where the owner's hand resting on the hilt had worn away one edge. They have now been mounted on perspex to show their original positions. As well as the jewelled handle, there were two jewelled bosses just below it. These have a cross in their design, so they may hold some Christian significance. The sword was 2 feet 9 inches long, rather shorter than most Saxon swords. The belt on which the sword hung was fastened by this great gold buckle. On the right would have been the purse, and on the left the sword. Then a jewelled strap seems to have run up to one shoulder, and a T-piece led a strap to the other shoulder. Then there were 2 shoulder pieces, and finally 6 other pieces whose function is not yet known. Altogether, this is easily the most magnificent collection of Saxon jewellery ever found. Probably the finest piece artistically is the great gold buckle, over 14 ounces of solid gold. Sliding latches on the back plate allow it to open and show how it was attached to the leather belt. It is decorated with a complicated interlace pattern, and at the top is a rather charming beast with a ring round his hips and ankle, a characteristic achievement of a craftsman who was one of the greatest goldsmiths of the Dark Ages. The purse is another astonishing achievement, with its fantastic accuracy of skill and technique. The gorgeous plaques of garnet and gold show an eagle attacking a duck, and a motif which has been called Daniel in the Lion's Den. These were probably set in an ivory backing. The clasps are among the most remarkable of the finds. They came out of the sand in which they had lain for 1,300 years in perfect working order and condition. They were attached to a garment by staples and then fastened together by a pin through the hinges. Even the animal's head on the fastening pin had garnet eyes. The garnet and gold colouring here is made even more vivid by little checkers of blue and white glass. The flat jewels are treated with a similar astonishing brilliance and delicacy of technique. Garnets are notoriously brittle and difficult to cut, and a modern gem cutter estimated that the curved stones might take up to 3 days to cut and the flat ones a day. All these garnets probably came from India. There are more than 4,000 of them. In this piece, they are cut even on the curve as well, and let in all round the edge of the buckle. But perhaps the most remarkable pieces of all are these gold and garnet pyramids, with more blue and white millefiori let into their tops. The edge and shoulder garnets of these are cut as prisms, so when they are lit from the side, they glow, a quite startling piece of technical virtuosity and artistic achievement, which it is generally agreed was the work of a local East Anglian craftsman. Another interesting find amongst the jewellery was that under the purse, presumably in the leather bag that backed it, were some coins. These were all Frankish tremises, made of gold, rather smaller and thinner than a sixpence. They were all struck in France at Merovingian mints. The coins are debased copies of Byzantine ones, and nearly all have a head on one side and a cross on the other. There are 37 in all, together with 3 blanks and 2 gold ingots. Besides their own intrinsic interest, there is a very significant point about these coins. Rupert Bruce Mitford is keeper of British and medieval antiquities at the British Museum and is in charge of the research and publication of the Sutton Hoo finds.
You might think that because there were 37 coins in the purse, that it was quite a simple matter to date the burial. But the trouble is that the 37 coins in the purse have no dates on them. There's only one coin that can be even said to have been struck by an individual king. We have to date them, as a matter of fact, solely on the style of the designs, and this is a matter of very great complication and extreme difficulty.
One immediate result of the finding of this jewellery was that from now on there was a police guard on the site. Night and day, 2 policemen, paid for by Mrs. Pretty, watched dispassionately over the excavation. There were other, less practical and more subtle changes as well.
When we first saw the jewellery, we were naturally wildly excited. It looked so beautiful, the garnets and the gold lying there in the sand and with the black ribs of the boat behind. And we all crowded round and looked at it and, of course, felt that we were in on a real boy's adventure from the point of view of the excitement of it all. I think we were also slightly alarmed because we realized that we'd got to be far more careful in future. Here we were, we few people responsible for an enormously valuable find.
I suppose that you're supposed to be terribly pleased when you realize that you're onto some remarkable gold objects. But the responsibility was such that certainly as far as I'm concerned, I had sleepless nights wondering not only what might not be the next morning, but how we were going to keep the thing quiet so that the news wouldn't get around, and how we were going to manage, just in the technique of excavation, with something which clearly was going to be so enormously rich.
Then, of course, the atmosphere was very much spoilt for us by the fact that we were watching the papers every day for news about the war situation, which we felt was imminent. And we all, I know, most of us who had had no experience of another war, thought that the moment it began, the sky would be black with planes, obliterating what was left of Sutton Hoo and probably us as well. Then, of course, another thing perhaps was the fact that many people won't understand very easily is that the mere finding of very valuable things alone is not enough to satisfy an archaeologist. It may be far more exciting to find one small, muddy little bit of decorated pottery belonging to the Neolithic period or the Bronze Age, which tells you the date of the monument that you're excavating, and for which you have excavated the monument to get that information. Whereas at Sutton Hoo, you see, we were posing problems, but we weren't answering them.
Gold has one great virtue. It is easy to excavate. The other objects made of metal or wood from the burial chamber, which they now knew had collapsed unrobbed into the middle of the ship, were much more of a problem to excavate. They also had to record everything in as much detail as possible. W.F. Grimes, now Professor of Archaeology and Director of the Institute of Archaeology in the University of London, then Assistant Archaeology Officer at the Ordnance Survey, tackled most of the next finds.
There wasn't time to get any special tools made for this job. One could think of a number of things that would have been useful, but that was that. The two pieces of equipment that were used were a curved packer's needle, which was very sharp when it started out, and an ordinary glue brush.
Another problem was that when they were clearing and lifting one thing, they never knew whether they were standing on another.
I've no doubt we did in fact stand on quite a number of the objects a number of times. But they were so tightly packed in sand, of course, and they were so substantial in themselves that many of them, I don't think they came to any harm. And you could dance on that jewellery if it was in sand, and it wouldn't hurt it. Not that we did.
For some time now, the scene of the excavation had been dominated by a great splash of purple, the big dish which lay in the centre of the burial chamber. The anxious moment now came for the excavators to tackle this.
When we lifted it and turned it upside down, the underneath of it and the foot ring on which the other little silver vessel was actually crushed, it was perfectly clean, and one could see the control stamp. And I remember looking at this with tremendous excitement and seeing the letters Anastasio and realizing this was a piece of Byzantine silver. And somehow the having of this great piece of Byzantine silver suddenly lying on the grass by the side of the barrow in the middle of Suffolk, this struck me, and it still does strike me, as being an incredibly exciting and romantic moment.
The control stamp of the Emperor Anastasius of Byzantium meant that this great silver dish was one of the few finds that could be dated exactly, between 491 and 518 AD. It was therefore already a century and a half old when it was placed in the ship. It was decorated with engraving in the late classical style, and its Mediterranean origin underlines from how far and wide the Sutton Hoo treasure was drawn in. As Stuart Piggott said, the underneath of the dish had a small ladle impaled on the foot ring. This too seems to have come from the Mediterranean workshop. Under the big dish there had lain another smaller one. This in turn, using the tools you've just seen, Professor Grimes cleaned and lifted. It came away from the sand quite cleanly and turned out to be silver of the same period, but with a rather crudely done female head, not quite in the centre. But perhaps the most surprising find of silver came from this rather unpromising splash of purple. It was thought to be a single object of very corroded silver, but after it had been cleaned and lifted, while it was sitting in the sun, suddenly there was a click, the top sprang up, and there underneath was a nest of silver bowls. They could be laid out on the grass, gleaming with a wonderful oystery glow. All are decorated with a different type of engraved decoration set in a cross pattern. They too come from the Byzantine Empire, and like the coins from France and the personal regalia from Sweden, emphasize from how far the Sutton Hoo treasures were drawn, even in the darkest period of the Dark Ages. The two spoons found near the bowls are particularly interesting because they have engraved on them in Greek the names Saul and Paul. They may have been a baptismal present for a convert and are the strongest evidence of Christianity in this otherwise largely pagan burial. Then, on July the 28th, there came a third important development.
One of the most memorable moments, really, after we had begun to find the jewellery, was when there emerged from the ground the awful spectacle of one end of the Great Whetstone. Because the Great Whetstone fairly glowers at you. And standing as it did, you see, in its position in the grave, it had a most military appearance. I mean, those faces on the Great Whetstone are not to be trifled with, are they? And one said at once a sceptre. Well, one very soon saw it wasn't strictly a sceptre, but nevertheless I think it's been agreed that it's probably a symbol of power. I think that was one of the most impressive moments.
Another impressive object that Professor Grimes also uncovered was the standard.
The standard was, of course, one of the big problems of this job because, in the first place, it was literally big. One of the biggest pieces of ancient iron, I suppose, that I've ever seen. And being iron, like the other iron objects on the site, it was pretty corroded.
Nothing like this standard had been found elsewhere. At first it was thought it might have been a portable lamp, but now it seems more likely that it was the standard of a king. Another piece of personal regalia was the shield. This also gave the excavators a difficult time.
I'm quite sure that shield had a very great deal of gold leaf on it, because the amount of gold leaf which was blowing about was frightful, and we couldn't do anything about it. And as fast as you caught a bit, it broke and flew. You see, that's one of the difficulties of excavating in the open air in a wind. A horrid story.
But by a remarkable piece of restoration, the shield has been put together to recover its original appearance. To the right of the boss is a bird of prey on the wing. To the left, a dragon-like figure with fierce teeth and 4 pairs of legs or wings. These motifs and other technical details show us clearly that the shield is a Swedish piece, brought from East Scandinavia. One of the most intriguing details is the human head done in garnets on the bird's hip. Could it have been a likeness of the king, who also wore this formidable helmet? It is a great iron crash helmet with the crest ending in a fierce-toothed dragon's head. This, like the sword and shield, has Swedish parallels, and what a magnificent and impressive object it must have been. The nose, mouth and upper lip are decorated in gilt bronze. Even the bronze eyebrows inlaid with silverware had a boar's head at each end and were set with garnets.
It's always very dangerous to try and identify an anonymous grave like this with any individual. We don't know many names in the 7th century, and unless there's a personal seal or a finger ring with a name on it, it's a very dangerous thing to try and do. In this case, the only hope that we have at all of identifying the grave with anybody is if we can say that it's the grave of a king. And furthermore, if we can say that it's the grave of an East Anglian king. Now, if we can say those two things, as we can in this case, I think, quite confidently, we know the names of the East Anglian kings in the 7th century and their succession.
The excavators also found various other possessions of this king. Under the great silver dish, for instance, there were subsequently found in this untidy heap the remains of a pillow stuffed with goose feathers, several pairs of leather shoes, and 2 bone combs. There was also a rusted mass of iron, which must once have been a coat of mail. An axe whose rusted remains you can just see diagonally across the picture, and 7 spears thrust through the handle of a bow. A number of other things seem to have been the equipment needed by a king to entertain his followers in the great hall, around which much of their life must have centered. These chains were to support the great cauldrons, which would probably have held stew. Then from this awkward heap emerged this smaller dish, which is remarkable because it may have come from Egypt. Inside, it is decorated with animals, including a lion. Inside this again was found this bronze hanging bowl, now restored on a perspex mount. It is a familiar Celtic object of a kind often found in Saxon graves. This is the finest and most richly ornamented of any that have survived. The escutcheons on the side are vividly decorated with red and green enamel and millefiori glass, while the animal heads below had garnet eyes. Inside is a bronze fish, a trout. Another object, which looked to be just an unpromising crescent shape in the ground, became a magnificent pair of drinking horns, which were made from the horn of an aurochs, an extinct breed of cattle. In contrast are these little drinking gourds, several of which have had to be restored, as only their mounts survived. No glass was found at Sutton Hoo, which was surprising, so it has been suggested that these little drinking cups took its place and were used for nips of some primitive form of whisky. Another object of very great interest was the harp, of which this is a reconstruction. The remains were in a beaver skin, and it is easily the earliest example known of such an instrument. The excavation of these sort of things was not the only difficulty. They then had to be packed so that they could be sent safely to the museum. The only official help they had was a dozen scaffold poles and a tarpaulin from the Ministry of Works. For the rest, they had to rely on Mrs. Pretty or their own improvisation.
We were rather hard put to know what to do with the packing of the objects, which began to come up in large quantities. And we scrounged, every time anybody went down into Woodbridge, we scrounged boxes and tins and bottles from chemists and grocers. And then, of course, anything delicate had to be wrapped so carefully. We thought of cotton wool, we couldn't find enough. And then we suddenly found a huge deposit of lovely cushiony, thick moss, which was perfect for all the packing, and we used it from that moment onwards.
Dr. Plenderleith, the keeper of the research laboratory and now director of the Intergovernmental Centre for the Study of the Conservation of Cultural Property, took charge of the packages once they left the site.
There were three aspects of my work for Sutton Hoo. The first was the ferrying of the contents of the grave from Sutton Hoo to the British Museum laboratory. That wasn't a very creditable piece of work because I'm afraid we ran out of petrol outside the museum gates and had to be pushed in the main door by some burly policeman. The second part was much more interesting. It was the unpacking of the parcels that had been made up by our friends Grimes and Co. At Sutton Hoo, and the discovery of a number of new interesting objects in the laboratory that had been carefully packed away without being studied by the excavators. We made the inventory, and we packed the material and put it in the ordnance tube for the duration of the war. After hostilities, the parcels were opened, and we then had the task of assembling materials that belonged to the main objects from the grave. The interest was attached, first of all, to the shield, which had a very obvious and very interesting shield boss. We had to find the shape, which we discovered was circular, and thanks to the fact that the periphery was ornamented with a dozen dragons of two different types, like the hours around the face of a clock, we were able to get some idea of the size, and thanks to the fact that at the back there was a hand grip with gilt bronze extensions, we got the information that the shield was of a lenticular shape, rather like a clock glass.
The only film of the excavation was taken on a small amateur camera after all the treasure had been removed, and there was only the clearing of the ship itself to be done. Nevertheless, the same painstaking care was being taken over the smallest detail, and virtually every handful of dust was searched and every detail recorded, so that as little as possible should be missed. Yet there was one very important thing the excavators found no trace of at all.
The excavators were all skilled and experienced. I don't think they ever lost sight of the problem of whether there was going to be a body in the grave. They were looking for it all the time, but they saw absolutely no trace of any skeleton or any remains from bone meals, brown stains in the sand or anything of that kind. There weren't even any vestiges of the teeth, the dense parts of the skeleton that go last. It's true, of course, that you don't see the stars when the sun is out. And they were busy, preoccupied with uncovering this fantastic jewelry which was unique and the like of which had never been seen before, and they might have been pardoned for missing, for not seeing indistinguishable, I mean, very light and inconspicuous stains in the soil or something of that kind, but I don't think they missed any visible indications. To this absence of physical remains, there was also an absence of all those personal things that you might expect the body to be dressed in, things like shoelace tags or buckles or embroidery from the edge of the cloak or a finger ring or a pendant. Well, now, these were negative picture, so that we were reduced to trying to get a more positive result by chemical tests on the grave goods. We covered the area where the body might have been thought to have been, analyzing fragments of absorbent material like textile and wood and leather for phosphate content, which would have derived from bone. But the results showed conclusively that there never had been a skeleton in this part of the grave where it was expected to be. On the other hand, there was evidence on the top of the great silver dish for the original presence there of something like 2.5 pounds of cremated bone. Well, now, we've no means ever of proving whether the source that gave these chemical results was animal bone or human bone. It could have been the remains of the funeral feast scraped up. So that it's not possible to say that this represents the burial in the ship.
There was another thing the excavators couldn't send away to the British Museum for further examination, the ship itself. Basil Brown's method of opening the mound had had this extraordinary effect of revealing the ghost of its entire original shape. The wooden planks had decayed almost completely, but with careful excavation it was possible to recover the original position.
You see, if you are inside a boat of that kind, and you are moving out towards the actual points where the skin of the boat once was, you have your warning as you approach the skin of the boat, slicing the sand carefully down, because you begin to see pink patches in the sand. Those pink patches are the premonitory signs, you see, of a rusty clench nail. And therefore you first of all establish your pink patch pattern, you see, and then you get more carefully back. And finally, of course, you have the end of your clench nail showing, and that is what you wish to establish everywhere, and you just go on doing it until you've done the lot.
The ship that finally emerged was a great open boat, 85 feet long, 14 feet wide, and drawing about 2 feet. Clinker built, it had 9 planks of 1-inch thick oak each side and 26 pairs of ribs. There was no sign of a step for a mast, so it must have been propelled by the 38 oarsmen there were places for. Although not as brilliant an achievement as the later Viking ships, it was still a good sea-going craft, and quite capable of bringing the invading Anglo-Saxons across the North Sea. An intriguing problem is how a craft like this, weighing at least 50 tons, was got up into the mound. The river then probably went nearly up to the foot of the cliffs below the mound.
The actual distance between the 2 points is not great, and although there's a vertical rise of 100 feet between the water level and the grave itself, there is, just to the north of the site, a fairly gentle coombe, up which the boat could be got without great difficulty on either a rough carriage, rollers, I don't know. I mean, the technical capacity of people who built the boat is obviously quite equal to getting it across country. And obviously they had plenty of horse transport, to say nothing of men, and so I really do not think that the business of getting it up the hill presents any great difficulty. It's only a matter of hard work.
Then the treasure would have been laid in the ship and the planked chamber put over it. What we can tell for certain is that the wooden chamber in due course collapsed onto the rest of the treasure, but the sand held the ship so firmly in position that even though all the timber had decayed away, the discoloured sand on the rivets left its outline magnificently visible to the excavators. The story of the excavation wasn't quite finished when the boat was finally cleared and the trench was left to turn into the unexciting grassy scar which is all that remains to be seen at the site today. Since the treasure had contained gold and silver, its ownership was subject to the law of treasure trove. Finally, the jury decided that there had been no intent to recover the grave goods and that therefore they were the property of the landowner.
The treasures found in the Sutton Hoo ship have been described officially as the greatest single archaeological discovery in the archaeological annals of England, and also as the greatest benefaction ever made to the national collections by a single donor in his or her lifetime. I don't think these descriptions are in any way exaggerated. After the inquest, the British Museum was faced with the prospect of having to purchase for what must be a very great sum of money these treasures for the nation. But fortunately we were spared the difficulty of doing this and the great expense of it by an act of unparalleled generosity on the part of Mrs. Pretty, who gave the entire treasure to the national collections. And it may now be seen by anybody who cares to go and look at it in the British Museum.
Into the mound they put ring, jewels, all that skillful work, as in the storehouse, ere men who risked something had gathered it. They left it to earth to keep the precious lot, gold under dust, where to this day it sits, not used by men, as it before was not.
Since that film was made 20 years ago, a lot of solid work has been put in. The excavations weren't finished in 1939, and I and my colleagues finished them in 1967 to 1970. The 3 volumes in which the work at Sutton Hoo is now described were not tossed off lightly. They're not exactly a coffee table book. 96 people contributed in one way or another to their 2,750 pages and their over 2,000 illustrations. So the British Museum, we can say, has taken Edith May Pretty's great benefaction to the nation very seriously. As a result, new facts have emerged, ideas have changed, and new perspectives have been reached. All this work can perhaps best be judged by just going to look at the objects in tip-top condition in the splendid new display in the British Museum. Perhaps the most important thing is that we are now much more confident about the date than we were, and this is because of advances in the study of the coinage. We think the burial is perhaps a quarter of a century earlier than we thought some years ago. The date bracket now that we have from the coins is between 615 and 635 AD. Well, now that makes it much easier for us. We can more confidently suggest whose burial this might have been, for whom the monument was erected. And I think there is no doubt now that it was the monument of Redwald, who was the most important of the kings of the East Anglian dynasty, and who died in 624 or 625. Just possibly the dating bracket would let in his eldest cousin or his son, but Redwald is by far the most likely person. The mixture of deliberate Christian elements carefully positioned in the burial in this sort of generally pagan context very much suits his belt and braces sort of attitude towards the new religion. He set up as a kind of insurance policy altars to Christ and the devil side by side. So the mixture of Christian and pagan elements suits Redwald to a T. And of course the other thing that suits him is the scepter and other elements of regalia which match his outstanding position as an important political figure. The other thing I think of interest is the fact that we have solved the mystery attached to the fact that there wasn't any body in the grave, the so-called cenotaph problem. We think now, as a result of a lot of scientific work, and particularly of our re-excavation of the site, that there was a body in the orthodox place in the burial. Mrs. Margaret Guido said a very interesting thing. She said, we were posing problems, but we weren't answering them. Well, I think most of the problems, those problems, have now been solved as a result of all the work that's gone in. But of course, it's also thrown up a whole crop of entirely new problems, and very important problems too. Is this the burial place of the dynasty, and are Redwald's 3 predecessors buried here? Or are we to expect other royal burials scattered perhaps up the Suffolk coastline or in Norfolk? And what about that formidable personality, Redwald's pagan wife, who must have organized this splendid funeral for him? Is she buried here alongside him? As we now see it, the grave field at Sutton Hoo is abnormal. There's no density of burials of ordinary people. What exactly is the status of this burial ground to the community that it represents? When did cremation stop in this sizable burial ground with its royal associations? And when did inhumation begin? Why did they go on burying into the Christian period in this site with its pagan associations, burials which showed no kind of nostalgia for pagan practices, empty graves with no grave goods? The great ship burial may have been a brilliant one-off idea, but there are lesser boats here too, and the great ship burial seems to be the climax to a long tradition. And lastly, in the wider perspective, what is the social and economic basis behind this phenomenal peak of wealth and ostentation? So many questions and so many answers to look for. And the thing that interests me is that the answers, the desired answers to these questions, the answers, my friends, aren't blowing in the wind. The answers are lying in the ground. In fact, I'm standing on them.
England, East Anglia, the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. Suffolk, linked by tidal rivers to the seaways to continental Europe. It was from Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries that the peaceful invasion of the Anglo-Saxons came. They settled here. The market town of Woodbridge might seem an unlikely place to find the origins of English kingship. And yet there they lie, just across the River Deben. now hidden by a 19th century plantation of fir trees, stands a windswept promontory some 200 feet high. And behind the trees, on the acid heathland, are 16 uninspiring grassy mounds built on the sandy outcrop, the site of Sutton Hoo. In the summer of 1939, the landowner of Sutton Hoo employed 3 local men to begin digging into the largest mound. Their leader was a self-taught archaeologist of remarkable ability, Basil Brown. He was to become the unsung hero of one of the most spectacular episodes in British archaeology. His work was to be continued by professional excavators once its significance became apparent, but it was through his locally acquired skill and perceptiveness, as this unique 8mm film shows, that the Sutton Hoo ship burial came to light. What he had discovered in the sand was the ghost outline, deceptively real, of a ship that had decayed centuries before, leaving only a shadow of compacted and discolored sand. As this shadow became stronger, first thoughts had been of a Viking ship burial, of a type already found in Scandinavia, but they were soon to uncover evidence of a date of more than a century before the Vikings, around 630 AD, a Saxon burial. What emerged by skillful excavation was the complete outline of a vast open rowing boat, a vessel which had certainly been used for a working lifetime and then manually hauled uphill and buried well below the original surface and beneath the mound itself to deter robbers. There had been no parallel to the discovery of this unique ship, nearly 90 feet in length, anywhere in Europe. But it was not the ship itself which was to cause the public sensation. It was the discovery in its midst of a burial chamber and the Sutton Hoo treasure. International symbols of wealth and power, designed in the 7th century to do what they still do today, to impress. This is the very beginning of English kingship, the first royal regalia. But for whom was this scepter designed? And what nature of society was it meant to impress? Are these the symbols of the last pagan king, or the first to turn towards Christianity? No body was ever found in this most lavish of burials. So what manner of king lay behind such an elaborate facade? A king with wealth, power, and security. A court and an elaborate social order. But where? To find the answers, a national body of scholars decided in 1983 to mount a full investigation of the whole site under the direction of archaeologist Martin Carver.
Sutton Hoo is one of the great names of this century. It's one of the greatest discoveries. The attraction for archaeologists is that a collection of material like that in the Mound 1 ship burial is not only striking for its beauty, but it's also striking in that it contains an enormous amount of information about an individual and the society to which that individual belonged. I think we are mainly interested in human behavior. This isn't an apology. I think most people are interested in human behavior, and if you are interested in it, if you care what happened to the human race, then you are interested in archaeology. These things are connected. So that Sutton Hoo must have that potential for it to be worthwhile to us.
Sutton Hoo is a site that has never given up its secrets easily. In 1965, Rupert Bruce Mitford, the great interpreter of the ship burial, returned to the scene to study what was left of the ship and the barrow, and to look underneath them. The ship still lay where it had been left on the outbreak of war in 1939. Not so much a ship as the impression of a ship. To record such a thing, yet alone preserve it, called for something special. Plaster of Paris was laid in blocks, and each block carefully removed, carrying with it the imprint of a sector of the hull with its rivets and ribs. Its rusty accretions and stained sand, shapes, colours, textures, these are the real signals from the Dark Ages at Sutton Hoo. The British Museum team confronted them as the 1939 excavators had before them. Now I, in turn, must learn to read these signals, discover new ones, and then take the study wider. My objective is not just a context for this ship, but for the community which built it. We want to get a sight of the formative years of England, to define a whole kingdom, and it's only archaeology which can help us.
Unfortunately, the archaeology is extremely difficult. We lack houses, we lack structures, and generally we lack finds. A site like Sutton Hoo, which appears to concentrate artifacts and also to concentrate the traces left by human behavior, is therefore going to be of extreme potential and extreme importance.
Such a site, such a precious resource, must be wooed, not raped. Because even the turf of this great area, it's about the size of a cricket field, contains clues about what happened here. An archaeological project, like any other, requires a plan of campaign and begins with reconnaissance. Long before we enter any of the barrows, we must reconnoitre them and map them carefully.
Well, the first part of our exploration is simply an inspection of the surface of the mounds. Very important that we should be able to distinguish between parts of the ancient mound itself and damage done in later centuries. Here, for example, we can see parts of rabbit holes, mole holes, and here you can see two grooves coming round, one there and one there, and these were probably caused by tanks. The site was used during the war as a tank training area, the mounds providing rather convenient hull-down positions in an otherwise flat landscape, and of course the tanks left their tracks across the mounds, and the mounds sustained a bit of damage as a result. Perhaps not obviously serious, but when one is excavating an area like this to try and discover everything that happened, then these will be significant.
No one even knows how big the site at Sutton Hoo really is. So in the adjacent fields, we search for signs of its edges. Every object picked up by the plough is exactly plotted. Over 4,000 such objects show a pattern, fading away as the edges are approached. Field walking requires skill and great patience. In 4 months, these two have walked over 75 miles. But every science has aspects that seem tedious. Zoologists measure animals, botanists count plants. We collect chipped, scorched stones, wash them, weigh them, label them, and map them, because they are the trail left by people who used this site a long time ago. A very long time ago, as virtually all the finds from the fields turn out to be prehistoric. On the turf of the newly mown barrow site, clues are given by different colours, different species of plant. which show where the ground has been disturbed by earlier diggers. Not always in the interests of science. We're making a map of buried holes.
Okay.
Feature 146, broadleaf grass, 4 readings.
Right. Everything found, everything we're going to find, has to be located to the nearest millimetre. You need perfectionists for this kind of work. We're not doing this for ourselves, we're doing it for students of Sutton Hoo who aren't yet born. And we make the assumption that the facts matter more than our opinions. Fine. Laying out a grid, laying the contours of the surface onto the grid, provides the bare canvas on which later digging will slowly paint in the details. One of the great advantages of archaeology in the 1980s, the electronic archive. At Birmingham University, where the Sutton Hoo Field Unit has its base, the first stack of data is entered on computer file. These are the readings taken in the field to reconstruct the surface contours. X, Y, Z coordinates for each point. There are 11,000 of them. Tantalising surface of the turf. We've mown it, drawn it, and mapped it. Now, can we see through it? Metal detectors have got themselves a bad name through the activities of a few treasure hunters, and of course Sutton Hoo is no stranger to them. In practice, the things which give the bleeps here are mainly bullets, bombs and grenades left over from Sutton Hoo's army days, plus of course the nails and bottle tops of earlier archaeologists. By showing where the metal is, the metal detector finds a patch for more sensitive instruments, such as magnetometers. These are easily distracted by metal. What they're looking for are filled-in holes, holes which once contained wooden posts or the body of an Anglo-Saxon. This magnetometer is exceptionally sensitive, but is still definitely on trial on these 25 acres of inscrutable sand. The results that come out aren't yet easy to interpret, at least not in isolation. You get a map of the magnetic noise made by post holes, ditches, and natural iron too. The trouble is, you can't always tell which is which. We need more precision than these two-dimensional maps can give. We need to see in 3 dimensions. Archaeologists at the moment are under an enormous pressure to record sites which are about to be destroyed through the exigencies of modern development. Practically all our energy goes into this. It does mean, however, that there is a danger of the discipline failing to develop technically above all, failing to take advantage of new scientific methods. We are essentially a forensic discipline, one that is trying to detect human behavior from traces, and therefore we need scientific aids of all descriptions. If people are prepared to sponsor a research excavation, a project for the sake of research, and at the same time to develop new techniques, then that must be good for British archaeology. Soil sounding radar is new and might give us the 3rd dimension. We've recruited its inventor, Mike Gorman of Cambridge University.
And it started up and moved a short distance and taking its next reading.
How far is that?
That's 10 centimetres.
10 centimetres for each reading.
Yeah, and in fact the step sizes are pretty accurately controlled because there's a very high gear ratio on the motors. They're quite accurate over a range of slopes. Small slopes, that is to say, anyway.
But you're going to need us to set out 10 centimetre parallel tram lines for it to run down.
I don't actually think it's going to be necessary to do 10 centimetre parallel tracks. I think probably we'll find that a metre will be sufficient. Yeah.
Oh, that's easy.
The antennas have a very wide beam, so they're covering perhaps a metre wide near the surface, but by the time they're down 2 or 3 metres, then perhaps they're looking at 2 or 3 metre width as well.
Yes. And then this is going to be computed together once we've got all the data.
That's right. Once you'll wind up with a three-dimensional network of points, which represent two dimensions will be distance along and across on the ground, and the third dimension will be the depth, as measured by the radar. The radar sends out, of course, a very short pulse and gets back an echo from any change in material. So if you've got a hole which has been dug into the soil and that's been filled in with a different material, then as the radar wave propagates to the soil, we'll get a reflection from that change, and this will be measured.
In more ways than one, Mike's machine is taking archaeology in a new direction.
Well, basically, I'm a physical scientist turned archaeologist. I've been working at the Scott Polar Research Institute because at the Institute we've been developing techniques for looking through ice in the polar regions, and I've been trying to extend these same techniques into looking through soils for archaeology. And thinking about it a bit more, it seemed to me that in fact archaeology was really rather unique among disciplines in that it actually destroyed its fundamental source material as it went along. It's really rather extraordinary when one thinks about it. The analogy which I developed was that it was something like a medieval historian reading through an original medieval source document, reading it through once and then burning it. I mean, he got some information when he read it through, but obviously it's not there anymore and subsequent people can't check it out and so on, and that's an analogy which I rather like regarding excavation. So I was spurred to try to develop a range of techniques for recovering archaeological information without excavation. Now, the work at Sutton Hoo gives us a wonderful opportunity to test out these new techniques, mainly the radar and some of the other new ones, because it's a long-term research project. It's going to be going on for 5 years. There will be excavation afterwards for comparative purposes, although ultimately one hopes that the techniques will be well enough developed not to require excavation, or at the very least that they will be well enough developed so that one can excavate an absolute minimum amount of the site. It's tremendously exciting to be able to see things in the soil when the soil is apparently opaque, and I find it very, very satisfying.
So, just imagine what archaeology could be like one day. Buried features described, without digging, by a series of radiographic slices, harnessed together to give a three-dimensional image. Our immediate target at Sutton Hoo, for example, is to see if the radar can identify ship impressions, burial chambers, or robber pits inside the mounds. It's a technique that could have profound consequences for excavation strategy and heritage management, not to mention the manufacturers of trowels. But these are early days, just the beginnings of something rather difficult. Powerful hardware like this at Cambridge is needed to draw up just a single slice, a single sweep down through the ground, and even then there's no guarantee we'll actually understand it.
Right, well here's the first radar plot on Sutton Hoo. Yeah, we'll want a bit of explanation, I think. Basically, you've got the surface of the soil at the top of the record, and you're looking down into the soil as you go deeper. This is from mound 12 in the northwest corner of the site. You're running over a barrow here, and you can actually see the interface between the barrow and the old land surface here. It appears to drop away, of course, because these measurements... Inverse reflection. Yes, these measurements are relative to the surface, and so we'll have to put in a correction to...
Well, it's showing the shape, at least.
It's showing the shape, absolutely.
Nice
and
work, Mike.
you can also see the internal structure
there's quite a lot going on inside the barrow. You see, just where the barrow ends, these internal reflections stop. Also, just at the bottom, in the middle of the barrow, there's something here, just underneath the old land surface, and that's rather interesting, I think. One doesn't quite know what that might be, but it's obviously a fairly strong feature to be producing that reflection.
In the centre of the barrow?
In the centre of the barrow, absolutely.
Under Mound 12, a burial chamber sends some faint signals to Mike Gorman's radar. A very inviting prospect. So, what about some digging? Well, not there, not yet. We still don't know what kind of a site we're in, only that it's varied, or how big it was, only that it's vast, or how long it lasted, only that it was a long time. Every expedition needs some kind of a map, and we haven't yet got one. So, long trial trenches are cut into the broad expanse of ploughed fields which surround the barrows. Fieldwalking told us that some activity here had left a scatter of flint and fragments of pottery. But for all we know, the traces of the settlement that produced them have been thoroughly erased by ploughing. We must see how much has survived and where. Less than 6 inches beneath the sugar beet, the dark brown pits begin to show. And we have a date, a complete Neolithic pot, somewhat the worse for wear after 5,000 years under the ground. The southern trench was cut through a strip of young potatoes. Archaeologists invariably work on other people's property, and Kirchers supportive and interested farmers and landowners are a real blessing. Their prehistoric predecessors also farmed this dry, sandy soil, and dug ditches, built fences. Much later, after the era of the great Anglo-Saxon cemetery, the medieval inhabitants built this metalled trackway. To some people, it must all seem rather a waste of time. Here we are, in the middle of a potato field, 110 metres from the nearest barrow, lovingly transcribing the pits of Bronze Age farmers. Why not get stuck into a mound, dig up another king? Well, archaeologists have learnt to be systematic the hard way. These days, we trust to method rather than luck. Sutton Hoo is like a big jigsaw, so we start at the edges. These exploratory trenches are cut into the fields simply to see something of what is there. They're not archaeological excavations as such. What they are pencils of light shining in the darkness. And here we pick up a Bronze Age settlement. A bit further on, a medieval trackway. These prehistoric settlements declare themselves by post holes, ditches, palisade trenches, and so on. So we know they're settlements, not, for example, burial sites. The medieval trackway is a ribbon of stones, just little tiny pieces of gravel packed into the ground and covered with silt, and in the silt, the ruts. Now, we can't say from this exercise the exact shape of the prehistoric settlements. We can't say where the medieval road is going. All we can say is that they're there. In one of these trenches, under the sugar beet, we had our first encounter with an Anglo-Saxon.
Put the board on there and the scale, I think, in the bottom of the grave.
The cutting crossed part of an oblong pit, which contained a dark strip looking like a root. It was the shadow of a leg.
Yeah, that's it.
We needed the whole individual, and we wanted to see if we could resurrect his whole shape in 3 dimensions, using these stains in the sand. A small extension was made so that the outline of the whole grave could be seen. To start with, it looked too short for the owner of the leg, but excavation gave the answer. He was sitting up, or rather hunched up, like someone in a bath. The body had very largely decayed, turned to a brown, crusty sand. and there were traces of a wooden coffin. This grave, aligned northeast to southwest, seems to belong to a style that is found to be Anglo-Saxon in Suffolk. The exact date isn't yet known, but the traces of 3 similar burials were found near the barrows in the 1960s. This body is 70 metres away, but it seems very likely that we are in the same period and in the same cemetery. So, the Anglo-Saxon burial ground, the same one that contained the ship burial, is roughly twice the size that we originally thought. Over 10 acres. These bodies are at their most revealing when first exposed. The shape and colours must be captured fast. The camera and Gillian Hutchinson are on loan from the National Maritime Museum. A pair of stereo photographs can be taken and drawn up to give a 3-dimensional plan far quicker than could possibly be done by hand. All the same, this is only a first attempt. There are things here we don't even yet know how to see. The reconnaissance in the fields is very encouraging, and the system, by and large, seems to be working. An Anglo-Saxon body, a Neolithic pot, many signs of settlement, most of it pretty ancient. Moreover, it looks as though we've just got here in time. The features are still quite readable, in spite of intense modern cultivation. This plough mark has just touched, but not removed, a Bronze Age hearth, a fire that went out about 3,000 years ago. Now, taking the results of our exploratory transects, we can already say something about the overall shape of our site. Firstly, there are no less than 4 prehistoric settlements within our area of interest. A Neolithic settlement, a Beaker settlement, a Bronze Age settlement, and an Iron Age settlement. But is it simply a coincidence that they are found beneath the Anglo-Saxon burial cemetery, burial site at Sutton Hoo? I'm beginning to think not. I think now that the site which the Anglo-Saxons chose as their prestige cemetery had already been occupied as a folk centre for some 3,000 years. So far, so good. But what about that wooded slope on the riverside? I wonder what the Saxons did with that. Immediately to the west of Mound 1, where the ship burial was found in 1939, now largely obscured by these trees, lies a small promontory, small flat promontory. Now, this promontory must have been exploited by our prehistoric peoples, and also it must have been used at the time that the Anglo-Saxon cemetery occupied the spot. What exactly could it have been used for? For example, we've lost a ship burial. One was discovered in 1860 and completely removed, the barrow completely removed. It could have stood on this promontory. We thought we would investigate what was there, and the object of the exercise was simply to strip a small area, 2 meters by 20, and see what kind of a strata we came up against. I reasoned that if there had been a barrow, then what we would find is a mass of disturbed sand and grey earth from the turves, just spread about. And then somewhere in the middle would be a trench where the ship had been buried. Now that trench could not escape us. It must still be there. But there are so many disturbances here with the roots of these conifers, the rabbits, that it makes all types of archaeology extremely difficult. Not just difficult, but until the trees are cleared, fairly impossible. Sutton Hoo is always throwing down challenges. The next one was to see if we could work literally in the dark. Right, fine night, moon coming later. Wonderful, couldn't be better. Now, we're going to do this as though we were always doing night shifts, which we haven't been doing before. It was actually some comments of the local farmers that suggested we should try working at night. They, like us, are always trying to get the upper hand in the battle with the elements. For us, it's moist sand which shows the colours, and the colours which show the features. and still damp air was what we were promised at night. And of course, we would be able to control the light, the most important factor of all. In practice, the air was soft and humid, making digging quite possible. So we know we can do it. That is, if we have to. It's horribly tiring on the eyes and the ears. However, the occasion did produce a solution to quite a different problem, one that had worried me during the survey. How to record minute undulations in the surface. The solution? High intensity and directional lighting.
No, sorry, other way. Go up. Yeah.
That same surface we had measured with 11,000 contour readings could now be seen in very fine detail. With a little improvisation and the help of Jim Hooker from City University, we could record these effects by photogrammetry, 60 feet up in the air.
If you could bring the back leg straight. That's it.
Can you move it round so it's closer to the camera?
It's not on the camera. There. Right. Okay, a bit more.
It only needs to be within a metre anyway, so...
Yeah, okay, then just put it a bit more towards the camera.
Right.
That's it. Hold it there for a minute.
Okay.
Next exposure. 16 seconds this time. Taking photographs from a swaying platform at night has its own problems, but the first results are promising. The plan will be made from stereo photographs, which carry traces of our own footprints and tyre marks, as well as the dark strip of an earlier buried feature over there to the right. In the small hours of the morning, another experiment with light, this time ultraviolet light. Police forces use ultraviolet light to search for the traces of buried bodies, and we're in the same type of business.
Yeah. My way a little bit more.
Your way?
What, here? That'd be fine.
Our victim was the Anglo-Saxon we'd already dug up, who'd emerged as a sculpture in the sand. But it wasn't clear exactly what we'd been looking at: decayed bone, flesh, clothes, or the wood of a coffin. Local photographer Edward Morgan built his own cadmium chloride filter for the job. We hope that under the UV lamp, the bone will fluoresce. And it just about does. This looks like a good way of learning more about a body. Make it glow in the dark. What kind of people were these? One body doesn't describe a society any more than one person makes an opinion poll. We need, as they say, a sample, and a good-sized sample at that. That will come, but at this stage in the reconnaissance we just need a few graves to indicate how people were buried, how well their remains have survived, how easily we can find them and describe them. Peter Leach, the senior supervisor at Sutton Hoo, and a very skilled excavator, has tackled this kind of problem before, as of course have many other archaeologists working on sand. There's no substitute here for good eyesight, a steady hand, and an open mind. This is not something a machine can do, or perhaps I should say, not yet.
With the excavation of a deep feature, obviously one of the primary objectives is to try and follow layers, in other words, changes of colour, changes of texture. In dealing with burials, which are on this particular site rather peculiar in their preservation, and consequently the excavation, the techniques of excavation necessary to get at them are perhaps rather special. In a sense, the skeletons survive as layers of soil, and therefore one has to follow the contours of those layers. The difficulties, of course, involved in that are that we are dealing with a three-dimensional object of rather intricate outline and uncertain preservation, and to follow that it's a very fine process to remove the sand from another kind of sand. We're dealing really with two sorts of sand really here. A humic sand, almost a peaty material, which is how the skeletons first appear, and of course the surrounding matrix in which they're buried, the backfill of the grave, which of course is a mixed, much looser sand. Superficially that may appear to be a fairly obvious difference, but in practice it is a very tricky job actually, getting the horizon of separation, if you like, between those two.
So every grave is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. At the present state of the art, our technique of consolidation is imperfect, and we have to coax out and record these human forms in a single day. Archaeology is about people. We look upon these bodies as fossilized human lives. Each one lived as a certain sex, to a certain age, to die at a certain date, as an example of his or her class and time. Vital statistics which we are learning to read, whether a man or woman from the size of the pelvis, the age, if we're lucky, from the crowns of the teeth, the date of death by radiocarbon dating of such fragments as remain.
We can clearly not preserve the skeletons in the way that one would preserve bone by removing them, although of course they are removed, the traces, the sand and what bone survives certainly is removable, but not in a comprehensible shape or form. As you'll appreciate, the sand, once dried out, is a very unstable material and will either blow off or in fact just goes to a beach-like consistency. It's very much like excavating on a beach, really, once the sun comes out and the wind dries everything up.
The main thing reminiscent of a beach is actually the tourists. Sutton Hoo attracts visitors, and very welcome they are. In the final analysis, the work is being done for the public at large. So, being looked at is part of the job.
Originally in here you would have expected to find a body of an Anglo-Saxon, therefore you're dealing with bones and such like. This particular soil destroys all evidence of bone. You remember I said that it's the great unknown, was there ever a body, over in Mound 1, the great Sutton Hoo burial. Here then we've got not bone but the trace of bone. It discolours the sand, and what you're seeing there is coloured sand in such a way it's possible to excavate it. At this end, on this one, you've got the head. Notice incidentally this idea of everybody being buried facing the same way is clearly confounded. Here it's the other way round, and here we've got the feet at this end going back to the head. If you like to just come past, you'll have a look down and see it.
Every burial so far discovered at Sutton Hoo has been different. Barrows, cremations, simple graves with or without coffins, aligned north-south or east-west, each betraying a different custom, a different attitude to death and the supernatural. Put them all together and you begin to get a glimpse of a community. Some people still pagan, others newly Christian. Some affecting the ritual splendour of a ship burial. Others, through poverty, belief or circumstance, laid face down in an empty grave on the fringes of the cemetery.
How's it going? Nearly done. There he is. On his face. His hands behind his head.
One hand.
Well, one hand, yes, one hand.
Elbow out.
Yeah.
Stunning, stunning.
It's really good. Can't do the other arm.
Magnificent. So you've got at least 3 different sorts of brown.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's all clear. You can see the pelvis.
Body stain. That line there.
Yes.
Behind.
That,
sort of arse
yes,
level.
that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, is that the body stain?
Well,
Or is that
could
coffin?
be.
You don't think that's coffin?
No, it's not coffin. I'm sure there's no coffin. Certain of it.
So we've got the light brown body stain.
Yes.
And there.
It's there intermittently, I think. Yes.
But that's different from the head.
Oh yes,
the
that's
bone of the arm.
Yes, that's
bone
nice.
of the pelvis, bone
Dark,
of the leg,
peachy
knees,
looking stuff.
etc.
Yes. Yes.
Nice work.
Rather a larger grave than was needed, in fact.
The last stage of our reconnaissance, and the moment has come to enter a barrow. I chose Mound 2 because that was where Basil Brown had already cut a trench. It was one of the barrows he opened in 1938. I decided to reopen part of his trench and to let him be our guide. Well, he laid out a compass bearing, so it's just about right there, like that. So it should be shaped in this club fashion. Now, as a matter of fact, I couldn't find the lead-in trench at all, and I presume it's covered in spoil there.
Yes.
But there are lots of candidates for the top side of the trench, a bit over the top of the barrow. But what we'll do is we'll try the tape, okay?
Okay.
On various measurements on here to see which fit best, and then we'll do a check from the ground surface. It wasn't quite as easy as it might seem. The plan sketched by Basil Brown didn't show clearly where his trench was on the ground. But I wanted to use the central part of this trench to get a preview of the inside of a mound without disturbing it further. The curious dinghy-like boat that he reported also needed reinspection if it had survived from its excavation nearly 50 years ago. A slice across the presumed site of the trench is chosen and the downward journey begins, initiated by two experts on early medieval boats. Gillian Hutchinson of the National Maritime Museum is joined by Angela Evans of the British Museum. Nearly half a century in Sutton Hoo's corrosive sand, and little can be seen of the edges of Basil Brown's trench, even beneath the turf. The surface is cleaned, drawn, photographed from above using a kite, then cleaned again.
Yep. Right.
The uneven edges at last appear, and the soil put back in 1938 can be identified and extracted. Basil Brown's trench collapsed at least twice, as his diary tells us. We are naturally anxious to avoid a similar fate. And the next one. Fine, that's true, actually. Is that your finger, I see?
Yeah.
Oh, could you remove that? Well, take another turn, William.
A little bit less.
Slightly premature. The timber shoring is designed to descend with the excavation, and to make sure the excavation doesn't descend on us. 10 days later, the top of the planks showed the profile reached far below. The sides of the 1938 trench are followed carefully down, giving us a preview of the barrow makeup as we thread our way along the edge of Basil Brown's cut, along the holes cut by grave robbers, around the displaced chunks of barrow which have slipped or slumped. And our every step is recorded, like the unwinding of a thread as you go down into an underground maze. At 12 feet down, below the level of the turf and the fields, the boat-shaped pit appears. And so does something else, rather unexpected. A curious curve, and at its lowest point, a slot. The curve is marked out by the junction of dark soil and bright yellow sand, and looks decidedly like the outline of a boat. Does this outline belong to the dinghy-like boat that Basil Brown excavated? It looks like nothing that he reported. The slot is almost like a keel. If it's really a keel, it is possible that robbers had cut through a bigger boat, a boat like the Mound 1 ship, and into the pit below. But only the excavation of the whole barrow will decide. So, Basil Brown has guided us well. his boat-shaped pit is exactly as he drew it, straight-sided and flat-bottomed. But his boat seems to be 18 inches underneath another one, and quite unlike any boat known to medieval history. Our investigations into this mound have followed the trail blazed by Basil Brown in 1938. It's taken us 6 weeks, what took him and his 2 colleagues 3, but our objectives were very different. He was cutting his way to the centre of the mound where he expected to find a burial chamber. We, on the other hand, were investigating the structure of the mound itself. The British Museum expedition in the late 60s had already shown how difficult it can be to distinguish between the structure of an original mound and the various spoil heaps left by later visitations, such as robber pits, excavations and so on. Now, in this mound we knew we were dealing with one that had already been robbed and had already been excavated partially by Basil Brown. We were, of course, ready to disbelieve what Basil Brown had found, particularly a straight-sided, flat-bottomed boat. But over the last 6 weeks, our admiration for this man has grown. He was able to distinguish layer from layer on this site, perhaps as nobody since has been able. So, we finished this year at about the point that Basil Brown started his investigations in 1938, in the same place, in the bottom of the boat that he found. We have now learnt to distinguish between major collapses inside a barrow, where distinction is between very slight colours, very slight families of colours, very slight textures, and so on. But it's not good enough. What we need to be able to do is to see every episode that has occurred in the build-up of a barrow in ancient times. We need to understand every episode that has occurred since, everything that happened to that mound and what it was used for, because that way lies interpretation of the society that we're trying to study. Well, what do we need? We need to see a long expanse of the inside of a barrow in section. We need to use that to experiment, to be able to read more clearly these episodes. And so that's what we'll be doing next year.